This is an interesting one because it's not. Well, I hear mostly Muslims use this because atheists don't really care whether Jesus claimed to be God or not.
Jehovah's Witnesses will use this too.
Yeah. So the 13th claim is that Jesus never said the words, I am God, worship me. So, in other words, Christians believe that Jesus is the creator of the universe, John 1 1. But Jesus never explicitly said, I am God, worship. So, therefore,
Why do we
the
say it?
Muslims
Why do we do
claim
it?
that the New Testament doesn't actually teach that Jesus is divine because the Quran literally negates the idea, or at least seemingly so. So, how would you respond to Jesus didn't say, I am God, therefore, you Christians have the doctrine of the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, all incorrect?
Yeah, the claim, of course, is going to be insisting on exact words. And if you run into people who were disciples of Ahmadiyyat, he was the one who popularized this in the 80s and 90s. What's important to understand is that before you deal with, and this will be true for Muslims, this will be true for Jehovah's Witnesses, this will be true even for skeptics if they level this kind of objection towards you, is that if they set up a standard, set rules for the game, if you will, and no one wins. You play by those rules, you lose. I play by those rules, I lose. It's not the kind of standard that anyone can play because it's a loser's game. If you make them play by their own rules and say, for example, okay, show me where he said, I'm only a prophet, don't worship me, in those exact words, Bible or Quran, I need those exact words, then of course the Quran can't be teaching that Jesus never denied to be deity because he didn't proactively deny in those words saying, I am not God, don't worship me. There's obviously passages that will suggest or put forward the idea that there's a difference between him and Allah in the Quran, but when you get down to it, the standard that's being put forward is absurd. So when you deal with this kind of objection, you first need to attack the formula before the numbers that get plugged into it. If Jesus never said the words, I'm God, worship me, that means he never in any sense could have taught that he was God, right? That's completely ridiculous. So if we're then going to move on from that point and say, where did Jesus say things that only God can say? Where did Jesus do things that only God can do? Then we can have a more productive conversation. And if you're talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, obviously you don't have to mention the Quran, but the idea is to get down to Jesus' claims to divinity are never going to be that straightforward because that's not how human language works. If Jesus is going to claim to be God, it's going to be through unique attributes or unique titles. And the best one for Muslims is one that, ironically enough, comes from the Quran, the Old Testament, and the New Testament, all exclusively applying to Allah, Yahweh, and Jesus. The passage I'm referring to, of course, is Surah 57 and verse 3, where it notes that Allah is the first and the last. Some translations tried to hide this, but if you go to the Arabic, it is noting his eternal nature. He is the first because there's nothing before him. He is the last because there will be nothing that outlasts him. He's the source of life. He is the only one that can claim to be eternal and not be lying. Likewise, the God of the Old Testament, whom Muslims claim to be in alignment with, is giving this title to himself in Isaiah 44 and verse 6. That's where the author of the Quran got the term, where, of course, Yahweh claims to be the first and the last, that besides him there is no God. Then we turn to Revelation chapter 1 and verse 17, my favorite verse in the Bible for different reasons, but this is just an added bonus, where Jesus is speaking to the Apostle John, and you don't even have to point out that it's Jesus speaking. If you want to read it along with me, I think, and this is going to work as well for Jehovah's Witnesses, the way the passage set things up in a way where you can't get away from the obvious is going to give them the opportunity to think rather than just recite what's been handed to them by their leaders. So Jesus, of course, is the one we know is speaking, but let's not even say that. It says in verse 17, when I saw him, pronoun, not a proper name, I fell at his feet as dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying to me, do not be afraid, I am the first and the last. Pause. Who can claim to be the first and the last? Who can truthfully claim the title of first and the last, according to Surah 57 and Isaiah 44? They'll say Allah. Then go to verse 18. I am he who lives and was dead. Now, wait a minute. When did Allah die?
I don't recall an account of that.
No, it's not in there. And behold, I am alive forevermore. Well, that makes sense if we're talking about someone who's eternal. They could physically die, but then exist forevermore into eternity. That would be an important detail to acknowledge as something that's true for God. But you have to ask, okay, did God the Father die? A Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, an informed atheist would say no. Did the Spirit die? No, Euclidean entity, I guess would be the fanciest way of putting it, does not have the capacity to physically die because he's not a physical being. So who among those who Christians would call God would in fact be capable of physically dying and rising from the dead, being alive forevermore after their physical death? That would be Jesus. And Jesus claims the title, the first and the last. Something according to the Quran is only true of Allah. Something according to the Old Testament is only true of Yahweh. Something according to the New Testament is something Jesus claims for himself. These are the sort of things that you would want to bring up, whether you're talking to a Muslim, Jehovah's Witness, or a skeptic who's done weird homework. But the point being made is just that. First, deal with the criteria. You have to find those exact words, or he could never have taught it in any sense. That's dumb. But if then you say, where does Jesus say things that only God can say, or do things that God can do? Go to passages that, of course, the Quran itself would say only Allah can claim about himself, and note that the author of the Quran didn't do his homework in pointing out those facts, that of course Jesus is the only one who said those things about himself, that God is the only one who could say those things about himself, and that Allah is apparently also at the same time. So either Jesus is Allah or the Quran is false. But the point being made is just that. If someone brings up that criteria, deal with the criteria before dealing with the objection, because it's not going to lead you anywhere productive, even if you were the one bringing it up. They wouldn't have an answer either.